Welcome to the Old Mac Gang Podcast, or OMG, a podcast vodcast with a panel of longtime Mac Apple users who want to discuss the most relevant apps and services to age-seasoned users. I'm Marty, an Apple enthusiast and podcaster. I'm a 67-year-old age-seasoned user of Mac Apple products, and I've collected a great group of folks, people that I've run into, and people that have been part of my Mac user group, and friends from MacStock, and they're all here as part of a panel tonight. So let's get to meet them all. And here's our group. Gary, why don't you start with an introduction?
Hi, I'm Gary. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, 87 years old, and a member of the Northeast Ohio Mac Users Group. My primary tools are my Mac Mini, my iPhone, and my Apple Watch. Chris?
Hey, I'm Chris. I'm 77 years old. I'm currently living in retirement in Tucson, Arizona. I got my first Mac in November of 1984 and spent 9 years with the Apple user groups and then almost 9 years working at Apple, and finished off my career doing university IT support in the Bay Area, San Francisco, that is. And so, I currently use an M1 Mac Mini, a 16 Pro Max iPhone, Apple Series, Watch Series 6, and 9th generation iPad, and lots of services.
I'm Peter. I'm 72 from Bay Village, Ohio, and I'm a user group devotee. Right now, I use a variety of Apple computing devices in concert: an M4 MacBook Pro, an M4 iPad Pro, an iPhone, and Apple Watch, each with their own accessories, associated apps, and services. All of these continue to make my life more pleasant and wonderful.
I'm Bob Wood. I'm also in Tucson. I am a 70-something-year-old Mac user and have been a Mac user since the Mac Classic and System 6.8, and a user group leader since almost that far back.
Well, tonight we're going to talk about news. And Peter, I think, brought it to the group as an idea to talk about, and how we consume news using our devices, how people, maybe age-seasoned users, consume news on devices. But before we get into that, Chris, I think, wanted to make a comment about the iPad, because we talked about iPads a little bit last week. The new iPads had come out. And Chris, you wanted to mention about affordability?
Well, we were kind of going pretty hard on the entry-level iPad in terms of it not having Apple Intelligence. And I think in our haste, we didn't notice that the introductory or the base level price is $150 less at $349. So I just wanted to say clearly, it looks like Apple is aiming that at kind of a non-Apple Intelligence audience. I mean, it could be education, it could be kids, it could be, a lot of stuff. But obviously that entry-level price, being as far down as it is, definitely puts it in a sort of a different category. And so I think we all were a little rough on it in terms of, wow, why would you want to buy an iPad if it didn't have Apple Intelligence? Well, this is one for people that don't need it and can save the money. So I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that, but that was my thought.
My sister surprised me this week. I don't know what iPad she got. I think it was a previous version iPad, but she had been using and doing all of her stuff on her phone. And I think her husband was like, being kind, not being difficult at all, but he said, let's get you an iPad as a primary reader for her. And I guess she does her email. I know she does her messages on it now. And she's looking at media. She's consuming some media, including these kinds of podcasts that I'm suggesting to her, and watching live streams on YouTube. And so for someone who's never had an iPad and is switching into that environment, yeah, the base price is really good. And for all functionality, you can do that. You can do that. And frankly, if you want ChatGPT, if it's not built in as far as Apple Intelligence, and I'm not sure Apple Intelligence has still got a lot of ways to go, but you can do all of that perplexity, you can do all of that just through an iPad, either a web interface or if they have an app. So if you want intelligence, you can find it if you need it and still make it very functional in terms of the iPad. So good point, Chris, with that. Good.
There's one more thing too, Gary. I'm thinking back to when Steve introduced the first iPad. And, in retrospect now, it stands out. At the time, we weren't sort of catching on because Steve was usually ahead of most of the crowd, obviously. But he was sitting in an armchair with the iPad resting on his knee. He wasn't at a desk. He wasn't in an office. And and nowadays for us seniors, I don't know about you guys, but I spend way too much time at my desk in my study, and the small of my back is starting to complain a lot. And, I should, follow Steve's example and pick up an iPad to consume a lot of media instead of looking at it on the big screen, and sit out in the living room in an armchair or something and, give my posture a break in the process. But
Yeah.
that's where his thinking was originally. And that we may get lost with all the gear and stuff in the meantime.
Well, we have a lot of links that will be in the podcast. Bob?
One quick thing to wrap up the iPad discussion. I bought a new iPad Air in the second or third week of January. So therefore, they came out with a new iPad Air and now a new iPad. You're welcome.
Yeah. Well, that's what we just need to listen to Bob's buying. When Bob's ready to buy something, that's a signal to everybody to just hold off for a couple of months because a new one will come out. Yeah, you're a bad predictor of buying cycles for iPads. So I think it's an interesting topic tonight, and I think first up is Chris on our list of who's going to talk about how they use news and how they consume news. Because when I think of consuming news, it's kind of, I don't think of it, I just do it. So having this question posed to us was good for me to think about the way in which I use devices to get news information, and particularly portable digital devices, which is what the old Mac gang is about. So, Chris, why don't you kick us off with, do you use news apps? And if so, how do you use them?
Well, I have to explain that, back in college and grad school days, I did a lot of studies on China and the Soviet Union. And then I had an opportunity to go to the Army language school and learn Russian. And so I've always been internationally focused, and I naturally gravitate towards things like The Guardian and BBC and international coverage. And my other interest in the last few years has been in photography, especially during my retirement. And so I'm sort of focused on those two areas. And in terms of photography, I watch a lot of YouTubes. That's sort of become the TV for us, because when the digital thing happened with television, my wife and I decided that we weren't really watching it. So we just gave it away and never went to digital and just use our computers and the web ever since. I do tend to use Apple News a little bit, but I read a local version of the online paper. I get emailed newsletters, like I said, YouTube's New York Times, various podcasts, especially Public Radio International's The World, which I enjoy very much as a daily podcast. But in terms of Apple News, it's really improved a lot, and News Plus. But I'm not a big consumer of news aggregators. I sort of like to follow the stories I want to read, and they tend to come to me now through the various heuristics. So I'm not sure how helpful I'm being in all of this.
Well, I think it's good that you've introduced a lot of possibilities. You also put it in your context. It's like who you are, where you came from, drives sort of how you consume information and news. And for listeners or viewers, that's another thing to think about is what is the information I'm consuming and what is my context with it? Because I've got a reason for using news aggregators that's different because of the context. And I'll get to that when I get to me. But Gary, I think you're up next in terms of how you are consuming news.
Well, I agree with like what Chris is saying, that I go to the news that interests me. When you buy a new Apple device, they give you 3 months of Apple News, which I tried, but it seemed to overwhelm me. And I really started getting my news from the New York Times and then the Washington Post. And then I've moved to the Atlantic and the New Yorker. So that's kind of where, and other places, that I go looking for news that I'm interested in. So that's kind of and podcast and NPR. So that's really my source of news. And I too, like Chris, early on, when I had a cable, I had a Dish. And what I liked about Dish is I could record and watch it when I wanted to. I could start watching a sporting event half hour late, and then I could slip through the commercials and sometimes even the halftime. But I found too, Chris, like you and Sue did, that I wasn't watching it that much, so I just discontinued it and then used that money to buy other sources. And lastly, Marty, I know you're going to put them in the show notes, but I went into the AP website, and that looks like another interesting source for me to check out.
Well, yeah, something I found frustrating about Apple News this week, and I didn't know that it was going to be an issue for me. I looked at an article and I thought, oh, yeah. And then later in the day, I was conversing with somebody and I thought, this is the perfect article to send to you. And I went back to Apple News and could not find it. There's nothing searchable within that index. And so it was a little frustrating. Now, maybe there are ways for me to save those articles. I wasn't thinking about that at the time, but I'm used to kind of searchable news indexes. And that's not part of Apple News as it exists right now, or at least I couldn't find it. So, yeah, Apple News has made a lot of upgrades, has incorporated a lot of stuff. That's very cool. But still, I wish I could return to it like a newspaper that I read in the morning and get that article out of it that I read and give it to someone else. Peter.
Yeah, well, I suggested the topic. I'm an avid reader and an avid news reader. And long before I spent too much money on Apple products, I spent too much money supporting the post office, bringing me newspapers and magazines, many of which I would read one columnist, and then that would be it. But I do use Apple News. I use News Plus. Our family does the Apple One plan for the family. So News Plus is available with its vast realm of sources that really replaced me going over to Barnes and Noble or Borders when it existed to look at the magazine stand and just find new stuff. I found after using News Plus for, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 months, by thumbs upping things I liked, by thumbs downing things I didn't like. And if it became too annoying, just saying to a particular news source, don't show me this. Apple News shows me a good variety of news and magazines, and the breadth is amazing. I do listen to, 30 to 45 minutes of podcasts in the morning, and there are ones that have show notes that I can push the articles that interest me into something I can read. Generally, Christian Science Monitor every day and Apple News Today, because they pull from a variety of sources and a couple other things. Like Chris, I like international news. And I pay way too much money to The Economist for a subscription, but their writing is unbelievable and it's unbelievably broad and gives you nice long perspectives from countries all around the world. And the one I haven't afforded yet is the Financial Times. They have a little app called FT Memo, which gives me 6 of their articles every day, which is plenty to not even think about the, I don't know what it is, $300 or $400 a year that it costs to subscribe to them. I always want a breadth of news, and I use apps to do that. I use Fiery Feed with Feedbin as a back end to aggregate some RSS feeds. One is for books, and another is for Apple News, and I look at those a couple times a week, and maybe a little less occasionally, the ones I have for math and film and music. And in every case, when I'm doing things, I'm always looking for things where I can push bookmarks into individual apps, because I do subscribe still to some things like the New York Times, like the Washington Post and New York Review of Books, some things mainly to get access to the archives. But surprisingly, I found that by having a paper subscription to a lot of things, sometimes only for Saturday and Sunday, I then get access to everything online, the bookmarks online, the archives, and everything else. So that's what I do. All of the ways I consume news allow me to do automation that push the bookmarks into the individual apps and push the links into a notes archive. And thinking about what you said, Marty, about sharing, I can take a link from Apple Notes, pull it open in News, after I've saved it on my laptop, and then convert that link into a URL that anyone can access. And I've been trying to think about a way that I can automate that without even going over to my Mac, where if I see something on my iPad or phone where I might more likely be browsing, that I could hit a button and push it so I'd have a shareable link for friends. That's a goal to be completed.
Yeah. I don't know. That's a problem to be solved somewhere. And there's probably a solution out there. I use a platform called Workana for developing show notes, and it could be, and I push all of my links to Workana for shows. And then I have a tab that has all of those links in it, and that's shareable because I share it with folks. So that could be one solution. There might be better solutions than that, but that's the one that comes to mind. Bob?
If when you see a link that you might want to share, if you push it into notes, it'll push the description and the link, and you can always find it. Apple's search is terrible, I think, in almost everything.
Yeah.
but if you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I agree with you, Peter, that notes is kind of an in-between for me. If I'm on my device, I'm on my phone rather, and I'm looking at stuff. I don't necessarily want to push it into Workana, although Workana does have an app. But pushing it into notes, I know I will find it there because I go through my notes regularly to see, and I use it as my place for putting things down. So from there, I can put it into Workana when I'm sitting at a desktop, and it becomes part of a show prep. So, Bob, your consumption of news, how you use devices to do it.
Well, my idea is that, and this may not be popular, is that all news is biased, even if you don't intend it to be biased. And therefore, my consumption of news is a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit some other place. And I sip and take a little drink of news on Apple News, on Yahoo, USA Today, and Fox News. I feel with that broad of a palette of news feeds that I get a little bit of everything. And maybe at that point, I'm kind of getting a balance.
So I guess I get an opportunity to talk about my news consumption. And my news consumption is a little bit more deliberate and intentional. I still get a local newspaper. Well, I used to get a local newspaper. My local newspaper got delivered through the winter and in little plastic bags. And by the time we'd get it at the end of the driveway, it would be wet inside a little plastic bag. The other issue that we're dealing with is a couple of things happened with the local newspaper. It got bought out by USA Today, so it's part of that network. So we're getting some local news and some Mac paper news, or whatever you want to call it, Mic News, or the kind of chewed up infotainment more so than actual news. The third thing that affected that is my wife's macular degeneration. So she has a hard time reading a newspaper. And so what we found as a solution was our local newspaper also comes out in a digital version. Now, a digital version she can put on the iPad and increase the font size for her to be able to read, although she has some issues with her eyes. So that was a good compromise. We still kind of want to get the local news, and we'll suffer with all the stuff that USA Today throws in there, but it is a source for what's going on in the community. It still remains that. There's also some online papers that have come up that I think in our county, we have one, or in our region of Northeast Ohio, we have one called the Portager, and I'm in Portage County. And it is a online paper that is really focused on what events are going on in our county. They don't cover national events. And so it comes out 3 times a week, and it's free, but we pay for it because we want to support people doing that. And it's gotten better and better. And it almost to the point where we can get most of what we get in our local printed paper using and reading the Portager. But even more so when they talk about community meetings that are coming up here and things like that, we don't generally get that in our local paper. So I got to start with local newspapers. My family grew up reading them. I'm sure everybody's family did to some degree. And we've always both been investors in local newspapers, but now we've got to go the digital route because of our needs in terms of our vision and issues with vision. I use the Apple News app. That is, when I get up in the morning, that's the first thing I open up and scroll through it. It's not the best in the world, but it's not everything I want. And I haven't quite figured out how to curate it like Peter has. I think I looked at one People magazine article, and now all I'm getting are People magazine articles. And it's frustrating that way because, occasionally I want to read that, but I don't want it to consume my feed. And I forget there's another source that seems to have overtaken my feed. So I'm having a hard time curating it. I do have the One Plus, so it becomes part of a subscription that I have for all of those. Because I'm involved in podcasting, and this podcast is a bit of an example of it, but also other podcasts that are basically, this is the weekly news related to Apple Vision Pro. I use a lot of news readers and aggregators. I know, Chris, don't want to have to filter through all of that. For me, every week when I prepare for the Monday night show that we do on Vision Pro, I have to search for news stories and RSS aggregators, and we'll mention a few of those. NetNewsWire is one of those. Fiery Feeds, Peter already mentioned. He turned me on to it. There's also Feedly, which was what I use to populate basically my Fiery Feeds. But once you get all those in and you make selections on it, I can do a search for certain keywords, and it's not perfect, but it generally pulls out every article in the last week that I can scroll through and get current articles for the show that I'm going to do tonight. So, for example, Vision Profiles, if I put Vision Pro in as a search feed, I will get articles about someone had a vision on how they should do this, and I have to filter through some of that and get better at that. But it's my major it's my major way of getting news on these areas. And I'll go to some of the online, like Macworld and Apple Insider and those sort of sources. But generally those are already in my news feed. So I'm seeing, if I go to the website and look at their recent articles, I'm seeing the same thing that's in my news feed. or my aggregators. I also use Reddit, which, okay, it feels like a more sophisticated Facebook of news. So, how trustworthy is it on there? But generally, the folks who are posting news, and you can just pull down and get a page that's current news or things that have been recent. The folks that are posting news through Reddit are linking them back to sources. So, a lot of Guardian articles on there, by the way. But there are other sources that you can find. So sometimes it's people just expressing opinions around news, and sometimes it's like, hey, look at this article, let's talk about this. And so that has become a source for me for news. And then there's a whole end of that's entertainment. There are, dad jokes subreddits. There's all sorts of other subreddits you can get into. But the news tab is a good source to start with. Sometimes it has a lot of news that I could care less about, like somebody just signed a baseball contract, and that gets in the feed. But you just keep scrolling and you'll find more posts in that. So those are my sources. I really particularly need to find ways to get current information on tech and Mac tech for the shows that I'm involved in and the shows that I do and the shows that I'm on. So that's probably 70% of my consumption is around tech information. So what I'd like to do is show a few of the sites. We can talk about them and then come back for any general discussions that we have about using news. So this is, of course, Apple News Plus. They have added some things recently, like they've added a whole section on recipes. And I'm a bit of a foodie, so I enjoy looking at recipes and then sending those articles out. It's interesting because they draw the recipes from magazines that they have in Apple Plus. So they're using their other sources and tying it into Apple News. It feels a little bit more of a comprehensive paper. I see this with the New York Times, and I have a subscription to the Times and the Post, and I see that they have these, particularly the Times, have these sections that are like entertainment or food, and they even have separate apps for those different things if you want to get into them. But that's what Apple, I think, is trying to do by pulling in this other content as part of their news feed, and they're drawing it from the magazines that are part of their News Plus magazine system. So Gary mentioned Associated Press is a good site where you can get pretty much up-to-the-date news on what's going on in the world. Reuters is another option that people go to, and trying to look at these in terms of the political, people can make arguments about, well, that's sort of very left-leaning or progressive-leaning. That's very conservative or right-leaning. So these are kind of generally considered in the middle in terms of their information that they present, Associated Press and Reuters. And why don't you talk about Feedbin, Peter?
Well, it's a place to get feeds from different places. So many places that have websites also have feeds, and you'll often see them on their main page or at the bottom of the main page. So if you were a Mac user and you were interested in 9 to 5 Mac or Mac Rumors or something like that, you can pull a feed from all of those places. You'll get each article's headline and first couple paragraphs, and through Feedbin, and maybe other people prefer some other readers like I do, fiery feeds, you can then scan through the headlines of all the articles published there and see the ones you want to read and read the entire articles. It's just great for that. And I have things that I visit less frequently, like math news, or I might have music news, and then I can just not read the headlines, but say, I have these favorite old bands, Little Feat, Beach Boys, whatever, and I can search for them and see anything that's popped up in the news with regarding those rather than even scan the headlines, sort of like you do with Vision Pro.
First of all, the most important thing you said in that last piece was that you're a fan of Little Feat. you and I think they're actually coming to Kent. Now, I mean, some version of the band is coming to Kent. Peter, you and I need to do a Little Feat concert when we can sometime. But I'll tell you, what I'm looking for in newsfeed, and maybe you know if it does this with Feedbin, with some of the other feed readers, news readers, you need to know what you're putting in. Like you said, if you go to any one of the Mac sites, at the bottom will be a link for an RSS feed. So you have to get the RSS feed to put it into some of these feed readers in order for it to find and make the connection with it. I'm looking for the feed one that says, here's what I'm interested in. And it gives me like 30 or 40 to choose from instead of me having to go out and find the RSS.
Right. And another thing you can put into these is not for all of them, but many newsletters, that send out things by email will also have an RSS feed somewhere. And these might be ones that want you to subscribe through Patreon or Substack or something like that. So you might not get all the inside scoop from that particular reporter who wants to establish themselves as a news source, but you can get a chunk of what they're reporting, and those are useful to put in your feeds as well.
So Fiery Feeds is an app that actually Peter turned me on to. I mentioned Feedly was the one that I was using. And Fiery Feeds is where I do a lot of my scanning for news articles. And do we have a cost on this?
Oh, I think it's like $10
free.
or $12 a year. Oh, that one's free. Okay.
Oh, yeah, but you can do
Feedbin or Feedly is the fee you pay for that, and that's like $10 or $12 a year.
Yeah, they have in-app purchases that are the kind of the pro model of it. And I think what that means is that, if I recall, the pro models allow you to have like more than 10 feeds. And if you're doing some serious news structure, then that is next. I put in NetNewsWire only because it's probably the longest standing one that I'm aware of. And it's a good app and it's a good reader. And I think it's on Mac and it's also on iOS. And basically, again, a news aggregator. And I
think all the ones we've mentioned sync between devices. So if I read an article and do something with it on my phone, it's not going to hit me again on my iPad or desktop.
And I'm going to click on this and see. Yeah, I'm clicking on NetNewsWire for iOS. I would bet that it's free. Yep, price is free with that. And then I'll mention this. This is probably not the best website to give you an idea of what Reddit is like, but this is Reddit on the web. They also have a Reddit app, which I do most of my reading on iOS or on the platform. And it does have ads interspersed throughout. But this is what I think is probably their latest feed. That's probably what's in here or popular. So if I want to go to any of these feeds, so there's some examples of news feeds and news readers that you could use. Guys, do you have any particular comments or things that you have after this discussion?
Oh, I like to say, go ahead.
Go ahead, Gary.
Well, I just meant about using Reader and using Safari. That eliminates all distractions of the article.
That is huge for people that have attention deficit like I do. There are web pages that I just can't even look at. And the Reader is my friend. And it also has Summarize, which on long articles is really a godsend. But the point I was going to make earlier is the aggregators can really flood you with information. And, I tend to look at a new aggregator and say, oh, here's 20 things I'm interested in, when I probably only have time to read 5. So, the woe to the user on that in terms of what you select. The other thing is there's a lot of what we call clickbait out there. And it's been a bit of a challenge to differentiate those YouTubers that are really just wanting you to click on their sites so they get credit for their advertising, and, YouTubes that are going to really give you some new and interesting and useful information. And so that's something we've just all got to do. And, some of the schools now are actually teaching courses around the middle school level in terms of how to pick and choose what you're reading on the internet and understanding what's real, what could be fake news, and all of this kind of stuff.
Yeah, the thing with news aggregators, as you'd said, it can overwhelm you. In my field, counseling, as an academic, I started using news feeders because journals would publish their table of contents in an RSS feed. So what I would do is create a folder that's my counseling folder, and in that I would put all of the RSS feeds for my field. Not that I have anything against going to the library, but what it does is it's like I can go through all of those table of contents and new ones as they come out with new editions of the journal and go, yep, I want that article. And frankly, if you clicked on the link, you'd probably get the abstract. You wouldn't get the whole article. But for me, it just allowed me to go through a series of journals that I might be interested in and page through the table of contents just to see this is an article I need to pull or need to get. So yeah, it's capable of just flooding you with information. But, sometimes you look at the unread numbers of feeds that you've gotten and you just go, well, that's gone. I'm just going to mark them all as read and start from zero again and move on with the posting and see what else is there. But yeah, that was my introduction to RSS feeds. Besides doing podcasts, we used to have to write RSS feeds, but for use in terms of news readers was to just simplify academic information for me and pull in survey information of what's out there and what's being published. Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, the earliest example I know of the fire hose of too much is some people who complained back in the 1500s after the printing press was invented, saying there's just too many things, you can't read them all anymore, anybody can just publish stuff. So this idea of being overwhelmed is longstanding. Walter Mossberg, who was one of the original national tech journalists, he wrote for the Wall Street Journal. He's now retired, but one of his main retirement projects is a thing called the News Literacy Project, and looking up their materials on the web. It's one place that a lot of teachers find things to use in the classroom to help people discern what is worth looking at and what's not, and how to sort of be judicious about what you choose to read as well.
Yeah, media literacy with everything that's going on in terms of the amount of information that's coming out is a big topic in terms of training students to be more media literate and making decisions around source material and content. We just, I think in this show, I don't know, any other comments from the group in terms of use? Because we're coming up in an hour, I think, or close to an hour in our time. So if there are no more comments, we wanted to introduce to listeners sources and ways that you can find sources of information using your digital devices. And maybe it's giving you some ideas about, maybe I want to try this. Maybe I want to look at something in terms of a new way of looking at information. So I hope you enjoyed it. Look at our show links in the show notes, and it'll get you to some of the sources that we talked about tonight. And I'll think about it as I put the notes together tonight and maybe add in some stuff that we talked about that didn't quite make it in to the notes as links. So yeah, Peter.
I did think of one more thing. Some of the news sources that I like a lot, especially when my eyes start to get tired and even making the text bigger is trouble, have audio versions of nearly every article. So The Economist, The New Yorker, The Atlantic. There's a lot of places that have listening versions of lots of their articles, and particularly the longer ones.
And make sure and wear your headphones so the whole household doesn't have to listen to it. Yeah, for those of us who have folks in the household and don't have that freedom of just listening to it out of every speaker in the house, it's a kind of way. All right, we'll need to talk sometime about topics for the next show and places we can go, but Just want to make an announcement. MacStock 9 is here for 3 days, July 11th, 12th, and 13th in 2025. Early bird tickets are here. You can save $50 from the final version of the ticket. Just go to MacStockConferenceandExpo.com, and there'll be information in the show notes about if you're interested in booking a room for it. And it's a great experience. I know Bob will be there. I know Gary will be there. This will be Gary's first one, so we have to go gentle on him, Bob. And I was on a podcast, I think with my son or somebody, and we had the website up and we were paging through it, and they have the one shot on the MacStock conference site where you have the picture from the back of the room and all you see are like bald spots populated. So he said maybe they should do one from the front just to make it look like it's just not Mac seasoned users who are there. But my son will be coming with me, and I think we're going to do a presentation together, which will be fun to do a father and son sort of thing. But that's coming July 11th, 12th, and 13th. Again, MacStock Expo and MacStock Conference and Expo.com. I'll have the link in the show note to it so you can check it out. That's a wrap for this episode. Our next live episode will be on Wednesday, March 19th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time through YouTube, where you can watch this crew on youtube.com/@oldmacgang. You can always pick up the podcast or video later if you miss the show live. Please share this with your friends, and also if you're in a Mac user group. This is a great podcast for folks in Mac user groups. Our music bed is from Philip Gross. It's called Marrakesh, courtesy of the Free Music Archive. More information about this podcast and others can be found at thepodtalk.net. Thanks to the group, Gary, Chris, Peter, and Bob. I'm Marty Gensius, and thank you for being part of the Old Mac Gang. We'll see you next time.